Machon, former MI5 agent, trying to get some more insight into what's been going on in Syria over the last few hours. Annie, thanks for joining us. I don't know if you heard the report there by our correspondent Paula. I've got the full Central Command statement here, just picking out a couple of key points here. They said that the coalition forces believe they were striking a Daesh and ISIL fighting position they've been tracking for some time. The coalition airstrike was halted immediately, as Paula said there, when coalition officials were told by the Russians that the Syrian army units were possibly in the area. They're saying it's not uncommon, actually, for the coalition centre to confer with Russian officials as a professional courtesy, although such contact is not required. There's been a lot of talk recently, hasn't there, about cooperation between Russians and the Russian-American forces in Syria to prevent such incidents happening. Do you think this potentially, firstly, could be a step forward, perhaps act as a springboard to increase levels of cooperation after such a tragic incident? And secondly, what impact could this have on the wider truce in Syria, which has already been in a fragile state over the last few days?
Well, one would hope that this would increase the cooperation. Russia obviously has greater human intelligence on the ground because it's cooperating, it's working with the Syrian authorities. So they have access to proper human intelligence, which is much better than what the Americans tend to use, which is, you know, satellite surveillance and electronic surveillance. So one would hope that this would increase their cooperation. I mean, this is a very fragile time. It's the week of a trial truce. If this truce holds, then they will both cooperate more closely to go after ISIS. Having said that, I find it slightly unbelievable that the Americans could hit this target thinking it was ISIS, when in fact ISIS is laying siege to the city, and the Syrian forces for years now have been known to be holed up in that city. So it seems rather strange that the Americans are just saying it's a bit of a mistake.
And just getting some breaking news in now again, Russia actually saying Russia convening an urgent Security Council session on the US-led coalition airstrikes against the Syrian army. That's coming in from the Foreign Ministry, and the Russian Foreign Ministry also saying the US didn't actually inform them of any plans to conduct that operation in Deir ez-Zor, which goes against obviously what we would be led to believe by the CENTCOM statement there. Annie, Russia and US, obviously, as we said earlier, are working to improve cooperation in Syria, but some senior US politicians seem to be opposed to that. Let's just take a quick listen before we get back to you on this statement from Ash Carter.
I've said before that we believe Russia has the wrong strategy. Despite what the Russians say, we have not agreed to cooperate with Russia.
As you know, we are not coordinating on a military-to-military basis with the Russians. That has not changed.
Given that CENTCOM has said that the airstrike was actually halted when coalition officials were informed by the Russians that Syrian army units were present, I'm starting to think if some cooperation on the ground had taken place before this whole situation could have been avoided. What do you think the prospects actually are of joint cooperation, given the quite, well, lukewarm rhetoric, to say the best, from US officials on this matter?
Well, I think we have a truce here where Russia has a relationship with the democratically elected Syrian government, and it is an ally, and it has certainly intervened already militarily to support that ally in the war against the terrorist insurgents. America, though, I get the sense is slightly divided. We have some of the military that really believe that actually they need to go after ISIS. That's the threat to the whole West. They want to work with Russia. And yet there's still this hawkish neocon political approach, which really still wants to just get rid of Assad for other strategic reasons, like supporting American allies like Qatar and now Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. So the Americans seem to be a little divided on this. Now, I am wondering particularly because there was a very notorious interview given by the former acting director of the CIA, I think a month ago, Michael Morell, where he said that he's supporting Hillary Clinton. He's obviously a Democrat, and he was advocating the assassination of Iranian and Russian support on the ground in Syria. And also, he was advocating the bombing of Assad, not to kill him, but to scare him. So I'm wondering if there are elements within the US power structure that are actually going ahead with this sort of plan and bombing Assad's military forces to scare him, to scare the Russians, to, you know, just try and make a point. And they're actually carrying this out already, rather than this just being a sort of wish list from the former acting director of the CIA.
We covered a story earlier also, Annie, I don't know if you heard about the alleged withdrawal of some US Special Forces commandos from a Syrian town on the Turkish border, allegedly being hassled by US-backed rebels as they went, and we've had some guests on the programme expressing an opinion previously that such airstrikes, even though on the surface of things they are accidental, and that is certainly what the Pentagon has said, that it wasn't intentional, that such actions may be perhaps an appeasement of the so-called moderate rebels, who the US is kind of losing control of to start with. You know, to start with, they were used as a weapon against Assad, and now they're simply out of control. Is that a valid point, perhaps, that they are doing this sort of stuff to try to get these rebels back on side?
That would be the other interpretation, rather than this airstrike being a mistake. It is indeed to reassure the so-called moderates who are being funded and helped and armed and assisted by the Americans. So I think that is a very valid point indeed, because the news that American special forces were being driven back, being run out of town by so-called moderate allied groups right next to the border of Turkey was deeply humiliating for the US. So if indeed this was a planned airstrike and it was indeed there to reassure these so-called moderate groups, that would make sense. Unfortunately, of course, we've seen over the last 5 years that these so-called moderate groups, time after time after time, will go over to the immoderate side. They will go over to the ISIS side, or al-Nusra, or Fatah al-Sham, as it's now called. So, you know, it's very difficult for America. They are playing with fire. It's a bit like their funding of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s against the Soviet forces. They are playing with fire because these very forces they are funding now could turn against America.
This airstrike came, of course, on the back of a truce, as you mentioned earlier, Annie, that's taken weeks and months to hammer out from all sides. It's fragile already as things stand. Vladimir Putin actually urged for the details of the Russian-American ceasefire deal to be made public. The US side didn't think that was a good idea, though. Let's just take a quick listen to what the Russian president thought of that decision. Just stay on the line. We'll come back to you in just 1 second.
It is connected to the difficulties the United States is experiencing in Syria. They still can't separate the so-called healthy part of the opposition from half-criminal and terrorist elements. I think that's dictated by the desire to preserve fighting potential in the fight against the legitimate government of President Assad. And apparently they don't want to publicize the peace deal for the sole reason that it will be immediately clear to the international community, to the Americans and the Russians, who is not complying with what.
Do you think Putin does have a point here, that they are simply trying to preserve fighting power, or does the US have some other reasons, perhaps even some entirely legitimate ones?
I think there probably is a point that they want to preserve fighting power, but I think also they are realistic enough to know that they can't control their so-called allies, these moderate terrorist groups within Syria. You know, so the truce is based on the fact that Assad's regime and his forces will not carry out attacks this week, and the opposition forces will not carry out attacks for a week, and that is the test to see if this truce will hold. Now, in this case, we have Assad's regime being a strong ally and, you know, supported by the Russians, so I'm sure that they can be actually made to control the situation and ensure there are no attacks and the truce is upheld. Unfortunately, the Americans are trying to herd cats in this case, with, you know, all sorts of different disparate groups who are all trying to fight the so-called Western Crusaders invading their country, and it's going to be virtually impossible for them to do that effectively. So I can see why the Americans would be reluctant to make public the terms of this agreement, because it's going to be very, very, very difficult for the Americans to ensure that the agreement is upheld. And I'm sure if it does fall apart, this week-long truce, then they will want to be seen to be the guys who tried to do good, who tried to seem strong. but actually, they're the ones in the weak position here.
And Annie, just getting back to that prospect of cooperation and to that airstrike in Deir ez-Zor, obviously the situation there is very difficult. The front lines are constantly shifting. This CENTCOM statement says coalition forces had been, as we said earlier, tracking the Daesh column for some time. They believed they were hitting Daesh fighters, instead hitting the Syrian forces. ISIL is, of course, excluded from the ceasefire, as is al-Nusra. So if the intention was to hit ISIL, that would have been entirely justified within the rules of that ceasefire. But how important is intelligence, as someone formerly working in that field on the ground, which you mentioned that the Russians have, to make cooperation and to make these airstrikes as effective as possible, and to, if not prevent entirely these sorts of incidents, then at least minimise them? How crucial is that cooperation and that sharing of coordination points, etc.?
It's absolutely vital, of course. I mean, you need the intelligence to wage an effective war in the first place. And for the Americans to over-rely on electronic surveillance, which they have been doing, for them to over-rely on satellite surveillance, which they do, they really don't know what's going on the ground. It's a very fast-changing environment with all these competing militias and these competing terrorist groups and the forces moving around. If you don't have that vital human intelligence, if you don't have access to it, then of course you're going to make mistakes at the very least. And this is why there is a vital need for the American coalition and for Russia to coordinate in its pushback against ISIS, because Russia has the access to that sort of on-the-ground intelligence. America seems to be lacking it.
And just very briefly, Annie, of course, we're just a few days into that ceasefire. We're seeing a diplomatic scandal rapidly emerging here, UN Security Council emergency meeting called by the Russians. What ramifications do you think this could have for the ceasefire, which is still barely begun effectively?
I would hope that, as an ally, Russia would advise that the Assad government actually adheres to the ceasefire. I think it's a good thing to do. I think it could work towards a proper, formally working coalition between the West and Russia in terms of trying to tackle ISIS, which is a threat to us all, and that is vital to world peace. So I do hope that Russia can ensure that the Assad regime at least adheres to that. And I hope that the US recognises the importance of that and can try and rein in its excesses, shall we say.
All right, Annie Machon, former MI5 agent, thanks for bringing us the latest there on that breaking news from Syria. No doubt we'll come back to you as more details emerge there.